Hey guys, this is for APUS. Remember, I posted your review sheet this weekend. Remember, your final is on, or midterm, whatever it is on Thursday. Focusing on the areas that are on the review sheet that we've talked about in the past few weeks. The Great Depression and the lead up to World War II. Also, I guess everyone handed in their homework assignment already. I'm going to have this video, which is not going to be that long, but then I'm going to have another video for you guys to watch tomorrow, and on Wednesday. And I know that everybody wants to watch the inauguration, rightfully, so you can wait to watch the video until then. All right, so today we're going to talk about the threat posed to American interests by the Japanese. Now, we had almost a well, I won't say single-minded, but we were very focused on Germany in the late 30s into 1940, trying to find some way to help the British hold out against the Germans. As the Germans were basically expanding all across Europe. So even though Germany was generally seen as the greater threat to U.S. interests, the news from Asia was just as ominous in many ways. In fact, FDR's strategy in many ways was to just try to keep the lid on Japan as he was trying to deal with Nazi Germany, trying to find all these different ways to try to help the British. We were beginning to build a two-ocean navy in the early 1940s because our navy was not big enough to actually deal with threats from Europe and Asia. President Roosevelt actually had a particular interest in the Navy. He was passionate about the Navy from childhood. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Wilson. So this was always an interest of Roosevelt's anyway. And Roosevelt said, "I simply have not enough Navy to go around." With the threats being posed by both the Germans, the Germans and the Japanese. So we began constructing a two-ocean navy that would be able to confront both threats. Now, you might remember a little bit about this from Global, but Japan historically has been starved of natural resources, particularly oil. And as they were expanding across Asia, they already had big chunks of China, they had Korea, and as they were about to expand even more deeply into Asia in the way that Nazi Germany was trying to expand across Europe, they needed fuel. Especially for their airplanes, jet fuel. And the thing is that they were actually getting a lot of their fuel for the United States. Now, at first, FDR was hesitant to actually declare a flat-out oil embargo against the Japanese, knowing that the Japanese needed oil so badly that actually going and taking oil away from the Japanese, or not selling any oil to the Japanese, could be seen as a warlike action by the United States. So Roosevelt hesitated to do that at first, but finally in 1940, with the Japanese bogged down in China, FDR declared an embargo on gasoline and scrap metal to the Japanese, meaning we were not going to sell any of those things that they use in order to power their war machine. We declared the embargo, but Japan continued expanding across Asia. They took French Indochina, which was a French colony that's modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in 1940, they signed an official alliance with the Germans and the Italians, the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. And the thing is that this is a significant move. Significant because now they were all the fascist powers, and I would actually group the Japanese as being a fascist power. They really are now all together in an official alliance, so that really changes things in terms of U.S. policy toward these countries. Now, in 1941, Japan ultimately seized all of French Indochina. And after that, FDR froze all Japanese assets in the United States and declared a total embargo against the Japanese, meaning we couldn't sell them anything at all. Now, the reason why the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, which we'll talk about in a minute, happened was because the Japanese felt that the United States Navy was actually going to, or the fleet, the U.S. Navy fleet, was going to be used to block their access to oil, from Sumatra, which is an island in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, which has a huge supply of oil. Now, ultimately, the Japanese took control over all of the Dutch East Indies by 1942. But the Japanese were basically not going to be able to continue their war efforts if we're not selling them any oil and we're blocking their access to get oil from other parts of Asia. And they thought the U.S. fleet was going to be used for that. Now that's why the Japanese made the decision to actually attack Pearl Harbor, which was a Navy base in Hawaii, which wasn't a United States state yet. It was a territory of the United States. Now, the Japanese felt that they have to attack the United States' ability to impede their own expansionism. Now, Americans had broken the Japanese code, by this time, and the United States government knew that the Japanese were planning some attack on U.S. interests or allied interests in Asia. Now, the presumption was that this would be either the Philippines, which was a U.S. colony in Asia, or it would be Malaysia, which was a British colony in Asia. So the idea that there would actually be an attack on the United States itself was really not something that was anticipated by people in the United States government. Even though a lot of conspiracy theorists in the years since Pearl Harbor, which are many, it's 80 years, have said that, well, the United States did know that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and they let it happen in order to give the United States an excuse to get involved in the Second World War. That theory, I do not believe. It really does not have much backing at all. It said the Japanese code said attack American interests, but it did not say anything about, attack Allied interests, but it didn't say anything about any attack on, on the United States itself, even though that theory is still out there. Now, negotiations with the Japanese were actually going on into late 1941. In fact, on the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese diplomats were actually still in Washington negotiating with the U.S. government. But then, the December 7th, 1941, the day that Franklin Roosevelt later said will live in infamy. Now, that day was when Japanese planes arrived in Oahu, Hawaii, which is thousands and thousands of miles from Japan, by the way, and attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, when we actually meet again next week, I'm actually going to show you, I know I said reenactment, and that kind of sounded weird, but I'm actually going to show you, like a timeline of the Pearl Harbor attack that morning, with real footage from that infamous day. Now, the Japanese subjected the U.S. Pacific Fleet to 3 hours of bombing. 8 battleships, 2 destroyers, 360 aircraft were actually destroyed in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans were killed at Pearl Harbor. So it was a sneak attack, and it was an attack on the United States itself, right? This is really something that was unprecedented, at least for the United States to actually be attacked in this manner by a foreign power. So an unprecedented direct assault on the United States. And the next day, December 8th, 1941, in a speech to a joint session of Congress, FDR, and I'll play you this as well when maybe I'll put a link actually at the bottom of this video so you guys can watch it. FDR in this speech said, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. And at this speech, he asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Now, the declaration of war against Japan passed with only one dissension. One congresswoman, a woman named Jeanette Rankin from Montana, actually voted against the declaration of war in against Japan. She had also been in Congress in 1917 and voted against the declaration of war against Germany in World War One. She was a pacifist, but she was in some company back then. There were a lot of people who opposed World War One, but no one really opposed World War Two except Jeanette Rankin. So the United States declared war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. 3 days later, the Germans and the Italians declare war on the United States because of their alliance with the Japanese. And Hitler did not really think of much of the Americans or the Nazis, really not thinking that they were actually going to offer much resistance at all to the continued, Nazi blitz across Europe. And Hitler actually called the Americans the half Judicized, half Negrified Americans. So did not, and he meant that as an insult, so as we might expect from Hitler. So they declared war on the United States, and then of course we reciprocated. So now, after years of going back and forth over FDR trying gradually more and more and more assistance to the British, now the United States was officially involved in the Second World War, and when we got involved in the war in late 1941, early 1942, things were actually not looking good for the Allies. Some people forget about this. U-boats have been attacking American ships in the Atlantic Ocean, German U-boats, yes, that again. Every day, 5 Allied ships were sunk in early 1942. And by 1942, 1,000 Allied ships had been destroyed. In the early months of the war, and this is after the United States got involved after Pearl Harbor. In the early months of the war, the Axis, remember the Axis, that's the name for Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers as opposed to the Allies, the United States and the British, and the Soviet Union, because Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, breaking their non-aggression pact. So now the Soviets were actually bearing the brunt of the fighting against the Nazis. But in the early months of the war, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, actually were on the move. Hitler pretty much controlled almost all of Europe, either directly or with fascist puppet governments in place throughout Europe. England was really the only country that was left in Europe that was not under control of the Nazis, as well as some neutral countries, Switzerland and Sweden, but pretty much all of Europe was in the hands of the Germans, and they plowed deep into the Soviet Union to the point where they were within 12 miles of Moscow. So they controlled a lot of that country as well. Japan controlled almost all the British colonies in East Asia, the Dutch colonies and the French colonies. So and ultimately the American colony of the Philippines fell under Japanese control as well. So the Japanese and the Germans were both on the move in the early months of our involvement in World War II. So they actually even had some other islands belonging to the United States. Wake Island, Guam, and the Pacific Ocean were actually controlled by the Japanese. So things were actually looking pretty good for the fascist powers at the beginning of 1942, and we had to basically mobilize our entire society to actually fight the Second World War. All right, guys, very good. So tomorrow's video, we're going to talk about how we did mobilize U.S. society to prepare for the Second World War. And I'll put the clip on the bottom of FDR actually asking Congress to declare war on Japan. We'll do that. I'll do that. And then when your test will be on Thursday, and then when I see you guys on Regents Week, which remember we're meeting, then we'll continue talking about, what U.S. involvement in the Second World War meant to not only to the war effort, but to the United States itself, how our country was completely transformed by our involvement in the Second World War. All right, so I'll see you in tomorrow's video. Peace.